There's nothing quite like the fear of not being able to provide for your family. For Carla Martinez, that fear became her daily reality when she lost her job and found herself down to her last $900, responsible for her 6-year-old granddaughter, Emma. With nowhere else to turn, she bought the only thing she could afford, an abandoned farmhouse that everyone said was worthless. The roof leaked, the floor sagged, and neighbors whispered it should be torn down. But it was theirs. As Carla began cleaning out decades of dust and neglect, she found something hidden in the attic that would change everything. A locked chest containing what would later be valued at over $200 million. The discovery would not only transform her life, but uncover secrets that had been buried in their small town for generations. How do you handle finding unimaginable wealth when you've spent your life struggling just to get by? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked driveway as Carla Martinez pulled her 15-year-old Honda Civic to a stop in front of what would be their new home. The car's engine gave a final weary cough before falling silent, a sound that seemed to echo her own exhaustion after 3 sleepless nights of packing, crying, and trying to explain to a 6-year-old why they had to leave everything familiar behind. Emma pressed her small face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the structure before them. "Grandma, is that really our house?" Carla followed her granddaughter's gaze and felt her stomach tighten. The Whitmore farmhouse stood like a tired old man who'd given up trying to stand straight. Paint peeled from its weathered siding in long, curling strips that danced in the morning breeze. The front porch sagged on one side, supported by a makeshift wooden post that looked as temporary as everything else in Carla's life had become. 3 of the upstairs windows were boarded over with plywood that had turned gray with age, and the remaining windows were so thick with dust and grime that they looked more like clouded mirrors than sources of light. "It's going to be beautiful once we fix it up," Carla said, her voice carrying more conviction than she felt. She reached over and smoothed Emma's dark hair, so much like her mother's had been at that age. "Remember what Grandpa used to say? Every diamond starts as a piece of coal." Emma giggled softly. "Grandpa never said that, Grandma. You made that up." Despite everything, Carla smiled. Her granddaughter had inherited more than just her daughter Sophia's looks. She'd gotten her sharp mind, too. "You're right, sweetheart. But it's still true, isn't it?" The paperwork rustled in Carla's lap as she picked up the deed, studying the official stamps and signatures that made this crumbling structure legally theirs. The real estate agent, a woman named Patricia with perfectly styled hair and a suit that probably cost more than Carla's monthly budget, had made no attempt to hide her disapproval during the closing. "Mrs. Martinez," Patricia had said, tapping her manicured nails against the desk, "I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this? The house has been vacant for over 20 years. The previous owner died intestate, and it's been tied up in probate ever since. There's no telling what kind of problems you might find." "The foundation alone, I'm certain," Carla had interrupted, signing her name with the same pen she'd used to sign Sophia's school enrollment forms, her husband Miguel's death certificate, and her own termination papers from Hendrick's Insurance just 6 weeks earlier. Each signature had taken something from her, but this one felt different. This one was giving her something back, even if she couldn't quite name what it was yet. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and something else, something old and settled, like dust motes dancing in abandoned sunbeams. Carla had grown up in houses like this before her parents moved to the city chasing better jobs and bigger dreams. There was something honest about old wood and creaking floors, something that reminded her of Saturday mornings helping her grandmother. shell peas on a back porch that always smelled of coffee and bacon grease. "Can we go inside now?" Emma asked, already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Let me check it out first, Mia." Carla stepped out of the car, her sneakers crunching on gravel that was more weeds than stone. The front steps groaned under her weight, but held firm. The key, a simple brass one that looked older than the paperwork, turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for them. The front door opened with a protest of rusty hinges, revealing a living room that time had forgotten. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that followed them inside, and the air held that particular stillness that comes with long abandonment. The hardwood floors, visible beneath a layer of dust and scattered debris, showed good bones underneath. Years of neglect. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with nothing but cobwebs, and the faint outline of where pictures had once hung. Emma appeared at her elbow, having ignored Carla's instruction to wait by the car. "It smells like Grandpa's attic," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever spirits lived in forgotten places. "That's just old wood and dust, sweetheart. Nothing a good cleaning won't fix." Carla ran her finger along the windowsill, leaving a clean trail through years of accumulated grime. Through the clear glass, she could see their neighbors, a neat ranch house across the street, where a woman in a flowered housecoat was already watching them with undisguised curiosity. The kitchen lay beyond the living room, separated by a doorway that had once held swinging doors, judging by the hinges still mounted to the frame. The cabinets were solid oak beneath layers of grease and dust, and the farmhouse sink, though stained and filled with debris, was the deep, practical kind that Carla remembered from childhood visits to her great-aunt's house in the country. "Look, Grandma." Emma had discovered a narrow staircase tucked beside the kitchen, its banister worn smooth by decades of hands sliding along its surface. "Can we see upstairs?" "Careful, Maya. Let me test each step first." Carla placed her weight gradually on each wooden tread, listening for sounds of rot or weakness. The stairs held, though they creaked a symphony of complaints with each footfall. The second floor revealed 3 bedrooms and a bathroom that had clearly been added sometime in the 1950s, judging by the pink and black tile that was popular then. The master bedroom faced east, where morning light would stream through windows that actually opened when Carla tested them. The smaller bedroom, Emma's room, had a window seat built into the wall beneath a window that looked out over what had once been a substantial garden. "This can be my room," Emma announced, spinning in a circle with her arms outstretched. "And I can put my easel right here by the window so I can paint the garden when we make it pretty again." That evening, as they ate sandwiches by candlelight at a card table Carla had borrowed from her neighbor at their old apartment, Emma pulled out her art supplies, while Carla organized their few boxes of belongings. Emma drew with the focused intensity that only children possess. When she finished, she held up her creation, a crayon drawing of their old apartment, complete with the yellow walls of their tiny kitchen and the spider plant that had hung in the window. "I want to remember where we used to live," Emma said solemnly, "but I think I'm going to like living here better. It feels like a house that wants to be happy again." From the mouths of babes, Carla thought, tucking Emma's drawing carefully between the pages of a photo album. As she looked around, their new home really looking, not just seeing the problems and the work ahead, she began to understand what Emma meant. The house did feel like it was waiting for something. For laughter, for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, for lights in the windows and smoke from the chimney, for a family to bring it back to life. That first night, as rain began to patter against the windows and find its way through several spots in the roof, Carla lay on an air mattress in the master bedroom and listened to Emma's quiet breathing from the smaller room across the hall. Pots and pans scattered around the house caught the drips, with irregular rhythms that sounded almost musical in the darkness. Tomorrow she would start making phone calls about jobs. Tomorrow she would begin the long process of making this house livable. Tomorrow she would figure out how to stretch the remaining $400 until she found work. But tonight, for the first time in months, she fell asleep without that tight knot of fear in her chest. They had a roof over their heads, even if it leaked. They had a place to belong, even if it needed work. And sometimes that was enough to build a dream on. 3 weeks of living in the Whitmore farmhouse had established a routine that felt surprisingly normal. Emma had started at Millbrook Elementary, where her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had called to report that she was adjusting well and had already made friends with a girl named Lucy, whose grandmother lived 2 streets over. Carla had found part-time work at the town's only grocery store, Henderson's Market-owned. She'd learned, by Mrs. Henderson's husband stocking shelves and running the register during the afternoon shift, that it wasn't much. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing they'd had before. The house was slowly revealing its character. As Carla worked through each room with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to stretch every dollar and every hour, she discovered that the hardwood floors, once cleaned and polished, were beautiful heart pine that glowed like honey in the afternoon light. The kitchen cabinets, after 3 days of scrubbing with baking soda and vinegar, had revealed their original oak finish and solid construction. It was while organizing the kitchen drawers that Carla first noticed the brass key. She'd been working her way through the accumulated debris of decades, rubber bands that crumbled to dust, pencils worn down to stubs, receipts from stores that had closed before Emma was born. The kitchen had clearly been the heart of the house once, and its drawers held the archaeology of daily life. Church bulletins from the 1980s, shopping lists written in faded ink, a collection of bottle caps that someone had saved for reasons known only to them. The key was in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of yellow dish towels that fell apart when she lifted them. It was substantial, heavier than modern keys, with an ornate head decorated with scrollwork that suggested it belonged to something important. The brass was tarnished nearly black, but when Carla rubbed it with a corner of her shirt, it revealed a warm golden color underneath. "What do you think this opens, Maya?" she asked Emma that evening as they shared a simple dinner of spaghetti and jarred sauce, one of the few meals Carla could prepare on their hot plate until she could afford to have the gas range inspected and repaired. Emma examined the key with the seriousness she brought to all mysteries. "Maybe it's for a treasure chest," she said matter-of-factly. "In the fairy tale books, old keys always open treasure chests." "Fairy tale-y, sweetheart. Real life doesn't usually work that way." "But sometimes it does," Emma insisted, handing the key back to Carla. "You always said Grandpa was your treasure, and you found him when you weren't even looking." That was true. Carla had met Miguel at a bus stop in the rain, both of them waiting for a bus that was running late. He'd shared his umbrella, and somehow, 43 years later, she was still grateful for that simple kindness. But Miguel was gone now, and treasures like that didn't come twice in one lifetime. Still, the key intrigued her. Over the next few days, as she continued cleaning and organizing, she found herself trying it in every lock she came across: the front door, the back door, a small closet under the stairs, even an old jewelry box she'd found on a bedroom dresser. Nothing fit. It was Emma who suggested they check the attic. "All the best stuff is always in attics," she announced on Saturday morning, having finished her cereal and cartoon shows and declared herself ready for adventure. "Can we explore up there today, Grandma?" Carla had been putting off the attic. She'd noticed the pull-down access in the upstairs hallway, but the thought of what 20 years of neglect might have left up there, mice, insects, possibly worse, had kept her focused on the more immediate needs of making their living space habitable. But Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and Saturday stretched ahead of them with no pressing obligations. "All right," Carla said, "but you stay behind me, and if I say we're coming down, we come down immediately. Deal?" The attic ladder, when Carla pulled it down, protested with the screech of metal that hadn't moved in decades, but it held her weight as she climbed up into the darkness. The space was larger than she'd expected, running the full length of the house with enough headroom for her to stand upright in the center. Dusty light filtered through a single window at the far end, illuminating the accumulated possessions of lives lived and concluded. There were boxes, dozens of them, stacked and scattered throughout the space. Furniture covered with sheets that had become shrouds of dust. A dress form wearing a wedding gown that had yellowed with age, but still maintained an echo of former elegance. Children's toys from eras that spoke of Christmas mornings decades. Past a wooden rocking horse, a dollhouse that was a perfect miniature of the farmhouse itself, complete with tiny furniture. "Oh my," Carla breathed. Emma's head appeared through the access opening. "Can I come up?" "Carefully. Very carefully." Emma ascended the ladder with the fearless agility of childhood, immediately gravitating toward the dollhouse. "Look, Grandma. It's our house, but tiny. And look, it has little people living in it." Sure enough, a family of small wooden dolls occupied the miniature rooms. A mother and father doll sat at a kitchen table no bigger than Carla's palm. Two children dolls played in what corresponded to the living room downstairs. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Tiny pictures on the walls, miniature dishes in the kitchen cupboards, even little books on diminutive shelves. But it was the chest that drew Carla's attention. It sat in the far corner, partially hidden, behind a stack of boxes marked Christmas decorations in faded ink. Unlike everything else in the attic, which was covered in dust, the chest looked as though it had been placed there with deliberation, positioned where it wouldn't be easily found by casual exploration. The chest was substantial, roughly the size of a hope chest, made of dark wood with metal reinforcements at the corners. It was clearly old, with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of a time when furniture was built to last generations. And prominently featured on the front was a brass lock that looked like it might possibly fit the key in Carla's pocket. "Emma, come look at this." Emma abandoned the dollhouse and picked her way carefully across the attic floor. "Is that the treasure chest?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think we might be about to find out." Carla pulled the brass key from her pocket, her heart beating faster than the discovery probably warranted. It was probably just old linens or documents, the kind of things people store and forget about. But as she slid the key into the lock, it fit perfectly, turning with a click that seemed to echo through the quiet attic. The lid was heavy, requiring both hands to lift. As it opened, hinges creaking in protest, sunlight from the far window fell across the contents, and Carla felt her breath catch in her throat. The chest was full, not just full-packed. Jewelry lay in neat compartments lined with faded velvet. Papers were stacked in careful piles, tied with ribbons that had once been bright colors but had faded to pastels. Small wooden boxes were nested within larger ones, each clearly containing something precious enough to warrant careful storage. Emma leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Is it really treasure, Grandma?" Carla reached into the chest with trembling fingers and lifted out a necklace, a string of pearls that caught the light and threw it back in lustrous gleams. Even to her untrained eye, they looked real, old, substantial, valuable. Beneath the jewelry were documents, deed papers, certificates, what looked like stock papers from companies she recognized, and photographs, dozens of them, showing families posed in front of the farmhouse during what looked like much happier times. Garden parties on the lawn that was now overgrown. Children playing where weeds now grew. "Grandma?" Emma's voice was small. "Are we allowed to have treasure if we find it in our house?" It was a good question. A question that Carla, in her shock at the discovery, hadn't yet begun to consider. Whose treasure was this? And why had it been hidden in the attic of a house that had sat empty for 20 years? But as she looked down at Emma's expectant face and then back at the chest full of what appeared to be considerable wealth. Only one thought managed to surface clearly through her amazement. Their lives were about to change in ways she couldn't yet begin to imagine. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Carla sat at the kitchen table with the contents of the chest spread carefully across its surface. She'd moved everything downstairs after Emma went to bed, unable to concentrate on anything else until she could examine each item more closely. The brass key lay beside her coffee cup, looking innocent despite having unlocked what might be the answer to every prayer she'd whispered in the dark months since Miguel's death. The jewelry was the most obviously valuable. There were pieces that even her untrained eye could recognize as significant. A diamond brooch set in what looked like white gold, earrings that featured stones she was almost certain were emeralds, and several necklaces that had the weight and luster of genuine precious metals. The pearls she'd first noticed were particularly beautiful, graduated in size and strung on what appeared to be silk thread that had yellowed with age but remained intact. But it was the Victorian era jewelry collection that truly took her breath away. Nested in a separate wooden box within the chest were pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. A cameo brooch carved with such intricate detail that she could make out individual curls in the woman's elaborately styled hair. A locket on a heavy gold chain, its surface engraved with roses and scrollwork. Rings set with stones and settings that spoke of an era when jewelry was designed to be worn for a lifetime and passed down through generations. Carla picked up the cameo, turning it over in the lamplight. The back was inscribed with initials A. 1887, and beneath that, in smaller script, "Until we meet again." It was the kind of romantic inscription that Miguel might have chosen back when they were young and believed that love could conquer any obstacle. The weight of the piece in her hand made her wonder about its value. She'd watched enough antique shows on television to know that Victorian jewelry, especially pieces in good condition, could be worth considerable money. But how much? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do with information like that? The next morning, after dropping Emma at school, Carla drove to the public library. The building was small but well-maintained, with a computer area that looked like it had been updated sometime in the past decade. She'd told her supervisor at Henderson's Market that she needed the morning off for a doctor's appointment, not entirely a lie, since the discovery in the attic had certainly affected her health in the form of sleepless nights and an anxiety that felt like too much coffee on an empty stomach. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind reading glasses, showed Carla how to use the internet to research antique jewelry. "Are you thinking of selling some family pieces?" she asked. "Maybe," Carla said carefully. "I'm trying to figure out what they might be worth." What she found during 2 hours of research made her feel lightheaded. Victorian cameos in good condition regularly sold for hundreds of dollars. Pearl necklaces, like the ones she'd found, if they were genuine, and she was increasingly certain could be worth thousands. The diamond brooch, if the stones were real, might be worth more than she'd made in the past year at Henderson's Market. She printed out several pages of information, paying the library's modest fee for copies, and drove home with her mind spinning. If even half the jewelry in the chest was authentic, she was looking at enough money to quit her job at the grocery store, fix the house properly, maybe even set aside something for Emma's college education. But that night, as she sat at the kitchen table going through the printed research, doubt crept in. How could she be sure the pieces were authentic? And even if they were, who did they really belong to? The house had been abandoned when she bought it, but that didn't necessarily mean everything in it was now legally hers. Did she have a moral obligation to try to find the original owners or their descendants? Emma, working on homework at the other end of the table, looked up from her math worksheet. "Grandma, you look worried. Is something wrong?" Just thinking about grown-up things, Mia. Nothing for you to worry about. Is it about the treasure? Carla had forgotten how perceptive children could be. Partly, yes. Emma put down her pencil and regarded Carla with the seriousness that sometimes made her seem older than her 6 years. Are you worried that we're not supposed to have it? Something like that. Well, Emma said, returning to her math with the certainty that only children possess. If it was in our house and we found it, then maybe it was waiting for us to find it. Maybe whoever put it there wanted someone like us to have it. From the mouths of babes, Carla thought again. But Emma's innocent logic didn't address the practical questions that kept Carla awake at night. Even if the jewelry was legally hers, by virtue of buying the house and everything in it, did that make it morally hers? And what about the stock certificates? She'd recognized some of the company names: General Electric, AT&T, companies that had been around for decades and had presumably grown substantially since whenever these certificates were issued. The next day, she made an appointment with Harold Peterson, the lawyer who had handled the house closing. His office was in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, and Peterson himself looked like he'd been practicing law there since the building was new. Mrs. Martinez, he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. What can I do for you? Carla had rehearsed this conversation, but sitting in Peterson's office with its law books and framed diplomas, she found herself more nervous than expected. I found some things in the household things that might be valuable. I want to make sure I understand my legal position. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. When you purchased the property, you bought it as is, with all fixtures and contents. That's standard language. Generally speaking, anything that was in the house when you took possession would be considered yours, unless there are specific claims made by identified parties. What kind of specific claims? Well, if someone came forward and could prove that certain items belonged to them or their family, and had been left in the house temporarily or without the owner's consent, that would be different. But after 20 years of abandonment, and with the original owner having died without clear heirs, such claims would be difficult to prove. Carla felt both relieved and more anxious. So I would own whatever I found? Most likely, yes. May I ask what you found that has you concerned? She'd brought one piece with her, the cameo, wrapped carefully in a dish towel. She unwrapped it and placed it on Peterson's desk. He picked it up, examining it with the careful attention of someone who'd seen his share of valuable objects in estate cases. This is quite beautiful. Probably late Victorian, judging by the style and craftsmanship. Could be valuable to the right collector. How valuable? I'd recommend having it appraised by a professional, but pieces like this, in good condition, often sell for several $100s, sometimes more, depending on the provenance and the current market. Several $100s for one piece. And she had a whole chest full of jewelry, plus the documents. She hadn't even begun to research yet. Driving home from Peterson's office, Carla felt like she was living in someone else's life. 3 months ago, she'd been facing eviction and wondering how she'd feed Emma. Now she was sitting on what might be a small fortune, hidden in the attic of a house she'd bought for $900. It was the kind of reversal of fortune that happened in fairy tales, not in real life. But as she pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse and saw Emma's drawing taped to the front window, a new one, showing their house with flowers in the garden and smoke coming from the chimney, she allowed herself to believe, for the first time, that maybe fairy tales sometimes did come true, even for grandmothers who'd stopped believing in magic a long time ago. Asterisk, the letters were tied with faded blue ribbon that crumbled at Carla's touch when she tried to untie it. She'd discovered them beneath the jewelry in a separate compartment of the chest, carefully preserved in what appeared to be oiled paper that had protected them from moisture and insects for decades. There were perhaps 24 letters, all addressed in the same flowing handwriting to my dearest Eleanor, and signed "Forever yours, James." Emma was at Lucy's house for the afternoon, giving Carla the privacy she needed to read what were clearly intimate communications between two people who had lived and loved in this house long before she was born. The first letter was dated June 15, 1923, and as Carla read, a story began to emerge that was both heartbreaking and romantic. "My dearest Eleanor," the first letter began, "I know your father has forbidden our correspondence, but I cannot let distance silence the heart that beats only for you. The work in Chicago progresses well, and I am saving every penny so that we might marry without need of your family's approval or assistance. I dream nightly of the day when I can return to claim you as my bride, and we can make our home in the farmhouse your grandfather left you." The letters painted a picture of a love story that had played out in the very rooms where Carla now lived. James was working in Chicago, having left Millbrook after Eleanor's father had deemed him an unsuitable match for his daughter. Eleanor was clearly from a well-to-do family. Several references suggested her father owned significant property in the area, while James came from more modest circumstances. But their love had been real and deep. James wrote of walking through Chicago's streets and seeing reminders of Eleanor. Everywhere a woman's laugh that sounded like hers, a garden that bloomed with the same flowers she tended, children playing games that reminded him of their own childhood together. Eleanor, it seemed, had responded with equal passion, though her letters were not among those preserved in the chest-dot. As the correspondence progressed through the summer and fall of 1923, James's plans became more concrete. He was working for an architectural firm, learning the trade while saving money for their future. He wrote of houses he'd seen that reminded him of the farmhouse, of modifications he'd like to make to create the perfect home for Eleanor and the children he hoped they'd have. But by winter, the tone of the letters had changed. "My dearest Eleanor," read a letter dated December 3, 1923. "I received your letter of November 20th, and while I understand your concerns about the gossip in town, I cannot believe you would let the opinions of small-minded people determine the course of our love. Your father may have convinced others that I am beneath you, but you and I know the truth of what we share. I will return for Christmas, despite your request that I wait until spring, because 3 years of separation have been trial enough for both our hearts." The final letter, dated December 20th, 1923, was brief and heartbreaking. "Eleanor, I arrived yesterday to find you gone, and your father's servants instructed to refuse me entry to your home. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile tells me you have been sent to your aunt in Philadelphia and will not return. She would not say when or if you might come back to Millbrook. I wait at the farmhouse, hoping these are merely rumors meant to discourage me. The house feels empty without the prospect of your presence to fill it with light. I will wait as long as hope remains. Forever yours, James." There were no more letters after that. Carla sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded in her kitchen nearly a century ago. She looked around the room, imagining a young man waiting through the cold days of December 1923, hoping for word from the woman he loved, slowly realizing that her family had succeeded in separating them permanently. That evening, when Emma returned from Lucy's house full of stories about the dollhouse Lucy's father was building and the cookies they'd made together, Carla found herself studying her granddaughter's animated face and thinking about the power of love to transcend time. "Emma, what do you know about the history of our house?" Emma settled into her chair at the dinner table, thoughtfully chewing her sandwich. "Lucy's grandma said the Whitmore family used to live here a long time ago. She said they were rich and had fancy parties, but then something sad happened and they went away." What kind of sad thing? She didn't know exactly, just that Mr. Whitmore lost all his money somehow, and Mrs. Whitmore got sick and died, and then nobody lived here anymore. Carla made a mental note to visit Lucy's grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to know more about local history than anyone at the library had been able to tell her. But first, she wanted to learn more about Eleanor and James. The next morning, she drove to the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in a small building next to the courthouse that she'd passed dozens of times without really noticing. The volunteer on duty was a woman named Dorothy Martin, whose family had lived in the area for 4 generations. Eleanor Whitmore, Dorothy said, consulting a card file that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Oh my, yes, that was quite a story. She was the daughter of Charles Whitmore, who owned most of the farmland east of town back in the 20s. Beautiful girl, by all accounts, but headstrong. Her father had arranged for her to marry the son of another prominent family, but she'd fallen in love with someone he considered unsuitable. Do you know what happened to her? She was sent away to relatives in the East. Philadelphia, I think. There were rumors she died in the influenza epidemic of 1924, but other people said she married and lived under a different name. Our father never spoke of her again, and the family declined after that. Charles Whitmore lost most of his property in the stock market crash of 1929, and he died a broken man in 1932. What about James, the young man she was in love with? Dorothy's expression grew sad. James Morrison. He stayed in that farmhouse for almost 2 years, waiting for her to come back. People said he'd sit on the front porch every evening, watching the road. Eventually, he gave up and left town. No one ever heard from him again. That night, as Carla helped Emma with her homework, she found herself thinking about the young couple whose love story had played out in their home. The chest in the attic began to take on new meaning, not just a collection of valuable objects, but a repository of dreams that had never come to fruition. "Grandma," Emma said, looking up from her coloring book, "do you think sad stories can have happy endings later?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well, if Eleanor and James couldn't be together, but their treasure helped us, maybe that's like a happy ending for them. Maybe they would be glad that their things helped another family be okay." Once again, Emma's 6-year-old wisdom cut straight to the heart of the matter. Maybe the chest wasn't just a stroke of luck. Maybe it was something more, a gift passed down through time from 2 people whose own dreams had been thwarted. To a grandmother and granddaughter who desperately needed a second chance. It was a romantic notion, probably too romantic for practical consideration. But as Carla tucked Emma into bed that night and looked around their slowly improving home, she allowed herself to believe that love, in all its forms, had a way of finding expression across the years. Asterisk. The call from Margaret Sinclair came on a Tuesday morning when Carla was getting ready for her shift at Henderson's Market. She almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, but something made her pick up the phone. "Mrs. Martinez? This is Margaret Sinclair from Sinclair and Associates Fine Arts and Antiques in Springfield. I understand you have some items you'd like to have appraised?" Carla's heart skipped. She'd sent photos of 3 pieces to the appraiser Harold Peterson had recommended: the cameo, the pearl necklace, and one of the rings. That had been a week ago, and she'd begun to think the appraiser wasn't interested. "Yes, that's right. I'd very much like to see these pieces in person. Based on the photographs you sent, you may have some quite valuable items. Would it be possible for you to come to Springfield this week?" Springfield was 2 hours away. But Margaret Sinclair's tone suggested this was important. "Could you give me some idea of what we might be talking about, value-wise?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Martinez, I don't like to make definitive statements based on photographs alone, but the cameo appears to be museum quality. If it's authentic and everything about it suggests it is, we could be looking at several $1,000s for that piece alone." Several $1,000s for one piece of jewelry that she'd been carrying around in her purse like a good luck charm. The pearl necklace, if those are genuine cultured pearls from the early 1900s, could be worth considerably more, and the ring appears to have a significant diamond. I really do need to see them in person to give you accurate valuations. That afternoon, Carla called in sick to work and drove to Springfield with the 3 pieces carefully wrapped in a jewelry box she'd found at a thrift store. Margaret Sinclair's shop was in a restored downtown building with elegant displays of antique furniture and artwork that made Carla feel underdressed in her Henderson's Market uniform. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s with silver hair, pulled back in a perfect chignon and an eye that seemed to assess everything it looked at. She examined each piece with a jeweler's loupe and precision instruments, making notes and taking measurements with the focused attention of a scientist. "Mrs. Martinez," she said finally, setting down the cameo and removing her loupe. "Where did you acquire these pieces?" "I found them in a chest in the attic of a house I recently purchased." "I see. Do you have any documentation about their provenance?" "I have some letters and papers, but I haven't gone through all of them yet." Margaret nodded. "These are extraordinary pieces. The cameo is genuine shell, hand-carved, probably Italian, dating to approximately 1885 to 1890. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and it's in remarkable condition. I would estimate its value at between $4,000 and $6,000. Carla felt the room tilt slightly. "The pearl necklace is particularly fine. These are natural pearls, not cultured, which makes them quite rare. The clasp is 18-karat gold, and the pearls are graduated and well-matched. Given their size and quality, I would estimate this piece at $12,000 to $15,000. $15,000? Carla's voice came out as a whisper. "The ring is perhaps the most significant piece. The center stone is a 2-karat diamond, probably mined in the late 1800s, with a clarity and color that you rarely see in stones of that era. The setting is platinum, which was just becoming popular in fine jewelry at that time. Conservative estimate would be $20,000 to $25,000. The numbers swam in Carla's head. 3 pieces of jewelry, 3 pieces out of dozens in the chest, were worth more than she'd made in her entire adult life. "Mrs. Martinez, are you all right?" "I'm sorry. It's just, this is overwhelming." Margaret's expression softened. "I imagine it would be. May I ask, are you planning to sell these pieces?" "I honestly don't know. I'm still trying to understand what I have. If you do decide to sell, I'd be happy to handle the transactions. I have clients who specialize in Victorian and Edwardian jewelry, and pieces like these are highly sought after. But you might also want to consider having the entire collection professionally cataloged and appraised. If the other pieces are of similar quality, you could be looking at a very substantial estate." Driving home from Springfield, Carla had to pull over twice because her hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. The appraisal paperwork sat on the passenger seat beside her, documenting values that seemed impossible to reconcile with her life as a part-time grocery store clerk living in a house that still needed a new roof. But the most overwhelming discovery was yet to come. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Carla finally examined the papers she'd found in the chest, but hadn't yet had the courage to investigate. Most were personal documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, deeds to property that had long since been sold. But at the bottom of the stack were several stock certificates that made her stomach drop. The certificates were for shares in companies she recognized: General Electric, American Telephone and Telegraph, Standard Oil of New Jersey. They were dated from the 1920s, and the number of shares seemed impossibly large. One certificate alone was for 500 shares of General Electric, purchased in 1923. Carla had no idea what 500 shares of General Electric from 1923 might be worth today. But she had a feeling it was more than the jewelry. Much more. The next morning, she was at the library when it opened, frantically researching stock splits and historical values. What she found made her feel like she might faint. General Electric had split its stock multiple times over the decades. Those 500 shares from 1923 would now be equivalent to thousands of shares of current stock. The American Telephone and Telegraph certificate was for 1,000 shares. AT&T had also split multiple times and had spun off other companies. The original investment, depending on how the calculations worked, could now be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. When she tried to calculate the total value of all the stock certificates in the chest, the numbers became meaningless. She was looking at millions of dollars, possibly tens of millions. Emma found her that evening sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and calculator tape, staring at numbers that didn't seem real. "Grandma, you look like you saw a ghost." In a way, she had. She'd seen the ghost of James Morrison's financial planning, his careful investment of the money he'd earned in Chicago, preparing for a future with Eleanor that had never materialized. He'd bought stocks in solid companies, the kind of investments a prudent young man would make when building a foundation for marriage and family. And now, nearly a century later, those investments had grown into a fortune that could change not just Carla and Emma's lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren for generations to come. "Emma," Carla said carefully, "if you had more money than you knew what to do with, what would you want to do with it?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all hypothetical questions. "I would make sure nobody was hungry," she said finally, "and I would fix all the houses that are broken so families could live in them, and maybe build a big playground where all the kids could play together." From the mouths of babes, Carla thought for what felt like the 100th time since they'd moved to the farmhouse. Leave it to a 6-year-old to cut through the confusion and get straight to what mattered most. Asterisk, the photograph fell out from between two stock certificates, fluttering to the kitchen floor like a leaf. Emma picked it up before Carla could reach for it, studying the sepia-toned image with the intense curiosity she brought to all mysteries. "Grandma, look. It's our house, but it looks different." Carla took the photograph and felt her breath catch. The farmhouse looked magnificent, freshly painted white with dark green shutters, flower boxes beneath every window, and gardens that stretched across what was now an overgrown lawn. A family posed on the front porch, dressed in the formal clothing of the early 1900s. A man with a mustache and stern expression stood behind a seated woman in an elaborate dress, her hair styled in the Gibson girl fashion popular at the time. Two children, a boy and a girl, stood beside them, but it was the woman's face that made Carla's heart race. Even across the decades and the fading of the photograph, she could see something familiar in the woman's expression, a combination of strength and gentleness that reminded her of the handwriting in James's letters. "My dearest Eleanor," she whispered. "Is that the lady from the letters?" Emma asked. "I think so, sweetheart." Over the next several days, Carla found more photographs scattered throughout the papers in the chest. They told the story of a family's rise and fall through images that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. There were pictures of elaborate parties on the farmhouse lawn, with women in flowing dresses and men in formal suits gathered around tables laden with food. Garden parties where children played croquet while adults sat in wicker chairs, sipping tea from delicate china. But the later photographs showed a different story. The family grew smaller first. The children disappeared from the pictures. Then Eleanor herself was absent. The final photograph showed only Charles Whitmore, looking old and defeated, standing alone in front of a house that had begun to show signs of neglect. It was while examining these photographs that Carla made a discovery that changed everything. She thought she knew about the situation. Among the papers was a birth certificate that made her hands tremble as she read it. Eleanor Whitmore Morrison, born March 15, 1925, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Parents listed as Eleanor Catherine Whitmore and James Robert Morrison. Eleanor and James had found each other after all. The story that emerged from the remaining documents was both tragic and hopeful. Eleanor had indeed been sent away to Philadelphia, but she had been pregnant when she left Millbrook. She had given birth to a daughter and, defying her family's wishes, had married James when he followed her east. Thought that their happiness had been brief. James had died in the influenza epidemic of 1925, just months after their marriage. Eleanor had died 2 years later, leaving their young daughter to be raised by Eleanor's aunt in Philadelphia. The final document in the collection was a will, dated 1923, in which James Morrison left everything he owned to my beloved Eleanor and any children we may be blessed with. The will had never been probated because James had died intestate, and Eleanor had died before claiming her inheritance. But their daughter, Eleanor Whitmore Morrison, had legal claim to everything in the chest. If she was still alive, that evening, Carla called Harold Peterson's office and made an emergency appointment. She needed legal advice, and she needed it quickly. The weight of what she'd discovered was becoming unbearable. She wasn't just holding on to valuable antiques. She was potentially keeping a family's inheritance from its rightful heirs. "This is quite a situation," Peterson said after reviewing the documents Carla had brought. "The legal implications are complex. The daughter would be nearly 100 years old now if she's still living. But she could have children or grandchildren who would have legitimate claims to this estate. What am I supposed to do? Legally, you're probably protected under the laws governing abandoned property. But morally, you might want to consider trying to locate any living descendants." Carla left Peterson's office with more questions than answers. How do you find someone who might not even exist anymore? And if she did find Eleanor Morrison's descendants, was she prepared to give up the financial security that could transform Emma's life? The moral weight of the situation kept her awake at night. She found herself looking at Emma sleeping peacefully in her little bedroom and wondering if she had the right to keep wealth that might rightfully belong to someone else, even if that someone else had never known it existed. But there were practical considerations, too. Emma was thriving at her new school. They had a home, something Carla hadn't been sure she could provide just months earlier. The chest represented not just money, but security, education, a future free from the kind of financial terror that had consumed Carla's life since Miguel's death. It was Mrs. Patterson, Lucy's grandmother, who provided the first real lead. Carla had finally worked up the courage to visit the elderly woman, hoping to learn more about the Whitmore family history. Mrs. Patterson lived in a neat cottage 2 streets over from the farmhouse, surrounded by gardens that showed the same attention to beauty that had once graced the Whitmore property. "Eleanor Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson said, pouring tea from a service that looked like it might be nearly as old as the farmhouse. "Oh my, yes, such a sad story. She was the most beautiful girl in town, but headstrong. Her father wanted her to marry the Hemley boy. His family owned the bank, but she was in love with that Morrison fellow. Do you know what happened to her daughter?" Mrs. Patterson's cup rattled slightly as she set it down. "Daughter? Eleanor had a daughter?" "According to the documents I found, yes. Born in Philadelphia in 1925. Well, I'll be. There were always rumors that Eleanor had been sent away because she was in trouble, if you know what I mean, but no one ever knew for certain. My mother used to say that Charles Whitmore never got over losing Eleanor, and that's what really broke him financially. He stopped paying attention to business after she left. Do you have any idea what might have happened to the daughter?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond Carla's shoulder. "You know, there was a woman who came through town about 15 years ago, asking questions about the Whitmore family. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, and she said she was researching her family history. She spent a lot of time at the Historical Society and the courthouse, looking through records. Do you remember her name? Morrison, I think." "Yes, I'm almost certain it was Morrison. She stayed at the bed and breakfast for 3 or 4 days. Very polite, very well dressed. She seemed particularly interested in the farmhouse. Drove by it several times while she was here. Carla felt her heart racing. Do you think she could have been Eleanor's daughter? It's possible. She would have been about the right age. And she definitely seemed to know more about the Whitmore family than someone researching random genealogy would know. That night, Carla sat at the kitchen table with a decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. She could continue to keep the discovery secret, ensuring Emma's future, but potentially depriving another family of their rightful inheritance. Or she could try to find Eleanor Morrison's descendants, knowing that doing so might mean giving up everything that could secure their future. Emma found her there at midnight. Having gotten up for a glass of water. Double quotes, Grandma. Why aren't you sleeping? Just thinking about things, Mia. Emma climbed into Carla's lap, something she rarely did anymore, having declared herself too big for such childish comfort just a few months earlier. Are you worried about the treasure again? Yes, sweetheart. You know what I think? What do you think? I think if we're worried about whether it's really ours, then maybe we should try to find out. Because if it belongs to someone else, they probably miss it, even if they don't know where it is. Emma's simple wisdom cut through all of Carla's complicated reasoning. Maybe the question wasn't whether she had the legal right to keep the treasure. Maybe the question was whether keeping it was the right thing to do. And deep down, in the part of her heart that Miguel had always said was her compass, Carla already knew the answer. The manila envelope appeared under Carla's front door on a Thursday morning, with no postmark, no return address, and no indication of who had delivered it. Emma was already at school, and Carla was getting ready for her shift at Henderson's Market when she noticed the thick packet lying on the hardwood floor of the entryway. Inside were photocopied documents that made her blood run cold. Town Council meeting minutes from 1928, bank records from the Millbrook Farmers Bank, property transfer documents, and a handwritten letter that began, "We know what you found in the farmhouse." The letter was unsigned, but its message was clear. Some secrets are better left buried. Some families have paid enough for the sins of their ancestors. It would be wise to remember that you are new to this town, and your welcome here depends on your discretion. But it was the historical documents that truly shook her. The Town Council minutes from October 15th, 1928, detail the discussion about the Whitmore situation and the need to resolve the matter of the unclaimed assets before they become a public embarrassment. The bank records showed a series of transfers from Charles Whitmore's accounts to other prominent families in town: the Hendersons, the Henleys, the Pattersons. What emerged from the documents was a picture of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business transactions. Charles Whitmore, devastated by his daughter's banishment and death, had become an easy target for the town's established families. They had convinced him to sell his properties at far below market value, to invest in schemes that benefited them more than him, to sign over assets when he was too drunk or too depressed to understand what he was agreeing to. The most damning document was a notarized agreement dated March 1929, in which Charles Whitmore signed over the contents of the farmhouse to settle outstanding debts. The witnesses to the document were Jonathan Henderson and Samuel Henley, the grandfathers of people who still held power in Millbrook today. But here was the devastating truth. The agreement was signed 6 months after Charles Whitmore's death. Someone had forged his signature to legitimize the theft of everything James Morrison had left behind for Eleanor and their daughter. Carla sat at her kitchen table, staring at the evidence of a conspiracy that had robbed a young woman and her infant, daughter of a fortune, and her hands shook with more than just fear. She was angrier than she'd been since the day she'd received her termination notice from Hendricks Insurance. The families who had stolen from Eleanor Morrison were still here, still benefiting from wealth that had been built at least in part, on theft. Jonathan Henderson's grandson owned a grocery store where she worked. Samuel Henley's family still owned the bank. The Patterson family had used their ill-gotten gains to build the real estate empire that now controlled most of the commercial property in town. And they knew she had found the chest. The phone rang as she was studying the documents for the third time. The number was blocked, but she answered anyway. "Mrs. Martinez?" The voice was male, older, with the kind of authority that came from generations of expecting to be obeyed. "I think we need to talk. Who is this?" "A friend. Someone who's concerned about your welfare and that of your granddaughter. There's a coffee shop on Route 9, about 10 miles south of town. Murphy's. Can you meet me there in an hour?" "Why would I do that?" "Because you're a smart woman who understands that some problems are best solved quietly, without involving lawyers or newspapers or other unpleasant complications." The line went dead. Carla sat staring at the phone, her heart racing. The implied threat was clear. Her granddaughter had been mentioned specifically, deliberately. These people, whoever they were, wanted her to understand that Emma's safety was at stake. But they had made a mistake in threatening a grandmother who had already lost too much thought. She called Harold Peterson's office and left a message requesting an emergency meeting. Then she called Margaret Sinclair in Springfield and asked her to expedite the formal appraisal of the entire collection. Finally, she called the Millbrook Historical Society and asked Dorothy Martin if she could schedule a private consultation about some documents related to the Whitmore family that might be of historical significance. She was not going to Murphy's coffee shop to negotiate with thieves. She was going to war. That afternoon, she picked Emma up from school early, claiming a doctor's appointment. Instead, she drove to Springfield, where Margaret Sinclair was waiting with a team of experts she'd assembled on short notice. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret said, as Carla carried the chest into the appraisal room, "I've never seen a collection like this outside of a major museum. Are you certain you want to proceed with a full evaluation? The implications could be quite significant." "I'm certain." What followed were 6 hours of careful examination, photography, and documentation. The final appraisal, printed on official letterhead and signed by 3 certified experts, valued the contents of the chest at $247 million. $247 million. The stock certificates alone were worth $180 million. The jewelry added another $35 million. The remaining items, including documents, photographs, and personal effects that had historical significance, accounted for the balance. But more importantly, Margaret had called in a handwriting expert who confirmed what Carla had suspected. The signature on the 1929 document transferring ownership of the chest's contents was a forgery. Charles Whitmore had been dead for 6 months when someone had signed his name to legitimize the theft of his daughter's inheritance. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret said, as she handed Carla the official documentation, "you're not just holding valuable antiques. You're holding evidence of one of the largest thefts in American history that was never prosecuted. If Eleanor Morrison has living descendants, they would have legal claim not just to this collection, but to damages that could include most of the major properties in your town. Driving home with Emma sleeping in the passenger seat and $247 million worth of documentation in her purse." Carla understood why someone had felt the need to leave threatening letters under her door. The families who controlled Millbrook had built their empires on stolen wealth, and her discovery threatened to expose not just historical crimes, but ongoing benefits from those crimes. That they had chosen the wrong grandmother to intimidate. She had spent months living in fear of eviction, fear of not being able to provide for Emma, fear of an uncertain future. She was tired of being afraid. And she was especially tired of powerful people assuming they could push around those who had less. The chest in her attic wasn't just Eleanor Morrison's inheritance. It was justice waiting nearly a century to be served. and Carla was going to make sure it was served properly. Asterisk. The original will was tucked inside a leather portfolio that Carla had almost missed, wedged between the wooden slats at the bottom of the chest. It was James Morrison's last testament, dated August 15th, 1923, and notarized by a lawyer in Chicago. The document was clear and legally binding. I leave all my worldly possessions, including but not limited to stocks, bonds, jewelry, and personal effects, to my beloved Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, soon to be my wife, and to any children born of our union. More importantly, the will included a codicil that would prove to be the legal foundation for everything that followed, should my beloved Eleanor precede me in death, or should she be unable to claim this inheritance due to circumstances beyond her control. These assets shall pass to our children and their heirs in perpetuity, to be held in trust until such time as they can be rightfully claimed. Harold Peterson read the document 3 times before setting it down on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. Mrs. Martinez, this changes everything. This will essentially create a trust that has been in effect for nearly a century. If Eleanor Morrison had descendants, they wouldn't just have moral claim to this estate. They would have ironclad legal standing. And if I can find those descendants, then you would be legally obligated to turn over the entire collection. But more than that, this will, combined with the evidence of forgery you've uncovered, would give those descendants standing to sue for recovery of assets that were stolen from the estate over the decades. Asterisk. Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying Carla with the expression of a lawyer who had just realized his client was sitting on the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Mrs. Martinez, if this case went to court, and if the descendants could prove that local families profited from stolen estate assets, we could be looking at one of the largest civil judgments in state history. The current value of properties bought with stolen money, plus interest compounded over 90 years, plus punitive damages. We could be talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. That evening, Carla sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, a legal pad covered with notes, and a determination that had been building since the day she'd found the threatening letter under her door. She was going to find Eleanor Morrison's descendants, and she was going to make sure they knew exactly what had been stolen from them. The search was easier than she had expected. Eleanor Whitmore Morrison had died in 1927, but not before giving birth to a second child, a son named James, born just months before her death. Both children had been raised by Eleanor's aunt in Philadelphia, and both had lived long enough to have children of their own. Eleanor's daughter, Eleanor Morrison Williams, had died in 1998 at the age of 73. Her son, James Morrison Jr., had died in 2001, 76. But both had left children and grandchildren who were very much alive and living in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The most promising lead was Dr. Sarah Williams Morrison, a retired professor of American history at Temple University, who appeared to be Eleanor Morrison Williams's granddaughter. According to her faculty biography, Dr. Morrison had specialized in early 20th century economic history, with particular focus on wealth transfer and inheritance law. She seemed like exactly the right person to understand the significance of what Carla had found. The phone call was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Dr. Morrison, my name is Carla Martinez, and I'm calling about your family history, specifically about your great-grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore Morrison." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Martinez, may I ask how you came to know about my great-grandmother? That's not a name that many people would have reason to know. I found some documents and personal effects that I believe belonged to her and her husband, James. I think you might be entitled to claim them." Another silence, longer this time. "Mrs. Martinez, where exactly did you find these documents?" "In the attic of a farmhouse in Millbrook that I recently purchased." "The house belonged to the Whitmore family, the sharp intake of breath on the other. End of the line told Carla that Dr. Morrison understood the significance of what she was hearing. "Mrs. Martinez, I think we need to meet in person. And I think I need to bring my lawyer." 3 days later, Dr. Sarah Williams Morrison arrived in Millbrook with her attorney, a woman named Janet Coleman, who specialized in estate recovery and inheritance law. Dr. Morrison was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Carla immediately of the photograph she'd found of Eleanor Whitmore. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her career uncovering historical truths that powerful people preferred to keep buried. "Mrs. Martinez," she said as they shook hands in Howell Peterson's office, "I need you to know that my family has been searching for information about Eleanor Whitmore Morrison for over 40 years. My grandmother used to tell stories about a great fortune that had been lost, but we never had any proof, and we certainly never knew where to look for it." Coleman, the attorney, was more direct. "Dr. Morrison's family has legitimate claim to one of the largest unclaimed estates in American history. The question is whether anyone is willing to help us prove it." The meeting lasted 4 hours. Carla presented the chest and its contents, the historical documents she'd uncovered, the appraisal reports, and the evidence of forgery and theft. Dr. Morrison examined each item with the careful attention of a scholar who understood that she was looking at primary source documents that could rewrite the history of her family. "My God," she said softly, holding one of James Morrison's letters to Eleanor. "These are love letters from my great-grandfather to my great-grandmother. We have one photograph of him and a few documents from when he worked in Chicago, but we never knew about these." But it was the evidence of theft that galvanized both Dr. Morrison and her attorney. "The families who stole from your great-grandmother are still here," Carla explained. "They're still wealthy, still powerful, and they know I found this collection. They've already tried to intimidate me into keeping quiet about it." Coleman leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the focus of a prosecutor who had just been handed a case that could define her career. "Mrs. Martinez, would you be willing to testify about the intimidation? And would you be willing to help us establish a timeline of how these stolen assets have been used to build wealth in this community over the past century?" "Absolutely." Dr. Morrison reached across the table and took Carla's hand. "Mrs. Martinez, I need you to understand what you're offering to do. You could have kept this discovery secret. You could have claimed the collection for yourself, and no one would have been able to prove otherwise. The fact that you're choosing to do the right thing, even though it costs you personally, that means everything to our family." That evening, as Carla helped Emma with her homework, her granddaughter looked up from her math worksheet with the perceptive expression that always meant she was thinking about something important. "Grandma, are you going to give the treasure to the people it really belongs to?" "Yes, Mia. I think that's what we have to do." Emma nodded solemnly. "That's what Grandpa would have done, isn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly what Grandpa would have done. Then we won't be poor again, will we? Because doing the right thing is a different kind of treasure." From the mouths of babes, Carla thought, hugging Emma tightly. Her 6-year-old granddaughter had just articulated something that Carla was still learning to understand, that integrity was wealth that could never be stolen. And that teaching Emma that lesson was worth more than any fortune. But as she tucked Emma into bed that night and looked around their slowly improving home, Carla allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing wouldn't require them to sacrifice everything they had worked to build. Maybe justice could be served without destroying the new life they had begun to create in the farmhouse where love had once flourished and where, nearly a century later, it was beginning to flourish again. Asterisk. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this since the tornado of 1987. Every folding chair was occupied, and people stood along the walls, spilled into the hallway, and pressed against the windows from outside. The local newspaper had run the story 3 days earlier under the headline, "Local Woman Uncovers Century-Old Fortune and Fraud," and word had spread through the county like wildfire. Carla sat at the front table, flanked by Harold Peterson and Dr. Sarah Williams Morrison, with the microphone that would allow her to tell the story she'd been preparing for weeks. Emma sat in the front row of Lucy and Mrs. Patterson, her small presence a reminder of what was really at stake in this room full of adults. Arguing about money and justice, the crowd was clearly divided. Near the front sat the families whose ancestors had built their wealth on stolen assets: the Hendersons, the Henleys, the Pattersons. They were expressions of barely controlled anger and anxiety, whispering among themselves and shooting hostile glances at Carla's table. Behind them sat the working families of Millbrook, people like Carla who understood what it meant to struggle, who had been dealing with the economic power of the established families for generations. Mayor Davidson, a thin man in his 70s, who had held office for as long as anyone could remember, called the meeting to order with the nervous energy of someone who wished he were anywhere else. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to discuss some serious allegations that have been brought to the town's attention. Mrs. Martinez has requested an opportunity to present evidence regarding the Whitmore family estate and certain historical irregularities that she believes the community should be aware of." Carla stood and adjusted the microphone, her hands steadier than she had expected them to be. She had practiced this presentation dozens of times in her kitchen, but facing a room full of people whose lives would be affected by what she was about to reveal made her heart race. "My name is Carla Martinez, and 3 months ago I bought the old Whitmore farmhouse for $900 because it was the only home I could afford for my granddaughter and me." Her voice carried clearly through the room, and she could see people leaning forward to listen. "I never expected to find anything more than a roof that didn't leak too badly and floors that would hold our furniture." She paused, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to hostile to sympathetic. Emma gave her an encouraging smile. "What I found instead was a chest in the attic containing items that belonged to James Morrison and Eleanor Whitmore, 2 young people who fell in love in this town nearly a century ago, and whose story didn't end the way most of you have been told it ended." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonathan Henderson, owner of the grocery store where Carla worked, leaned forward in his seat with an expression that was definitely not friendly. "James Morrison didn't just disappear after Eleanor was sent away," Carla continued. "He followed her to Philadelphia, where they were married and had 2 children before both died young in the influenza epidemic. Before James died, he had invested his savings in stocks and bonds that he intended to provide security for his wife and children." She lifted the first document from the stack in front of her. "This is James Morrison's will, dated 1923, leaving everything to Eleanor and their children. The investments he made stocks in General Electric, AT&T, and other companies have grown over the past century to a value of over $200 million. The room erupted. People turned to their neighbors. Voices rose in excitement and disbelief, and Mayor Davidson had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. "Furthermore," Carla said when the noise subsided, "I have evidence that Charles Whitmore, Eleanor's father, did not lose his fortune through poor business decisions, as been commonly believed. He was systematically cheated out of his assets by prominent families in this town who took advantage of his grief and depression after losing his daughter." Now the murmur turned darker. Samuel Henley, Jr., whose family owned the bank, stood up in his seat. "Mrs. Martinez, these are very serious accusations. I hope you have substantial proof to back up these claims." "I do." Carla lifted another document. "This is a notarized agreement dated March 1929, in which Charles Whitmore supposedly signed over the contents of the farmhouse to settle debts with your grandfather and Jonathan Henderson's grandfather, among others." She paused, letting the tension build in the room. Charles Whitmore died in October 1928. This agreement was signed 6 months after his death. The signature is a forgery. The room exploded into chaos. Henderson was on his feet, shouting something about defamation. Henley was pointing an accusing finger at Carla, his face red with anger. Other voices joined in, some demanding proof, others calling for order, still others expressing outrage at what they were hearing. Through the noise, Carla could hear Emma's clear voice. "Let my grandma finish talking." The room quieted, perhaps surprised to hear from the 6-year-old in the front row, perhaps remembering that whatever else was happening here, a child was watching adults behave badly. The families who forged that document didn't just steal from Charles Whitmore, Carla continued, her voice stronger now. They stole from Eleanor Morrison and her children, and from their children's children. They built their wealth and their power in this community on money that belonged to a young mother and her babies, who had already lost everything else. Dr. Morrison stood beside her. "My name is Dr. Sarah Williams Morrison. Eleanor Whitmore Morrison was my great-grandmother. James Morrison was my great-grandfather. Mrs. Martinez contacted my family because she believed we had a right to know what had been stolen from us." The room was completely quiet now, everyone straining to hear what came next. "My family has been searching for information about Eleanor and James for over 40 years. We knew there had been wealth that was lost, but we never knew it had been stolen. We certainly never knew it was being used to build fortunes for the families who stole it." She gestured toward the back of the room, where a man in an expensive suit was taking notes. "That gentleman is my attorney, and tomorrow morning we will be filing suit in federal court to recover not just the original estate, but damages for nearly a century of theft, fraud, and unjust enrichment." Henderson was shouting again something about statute of limitations and frivolous lawsuits. Henley was demanding to see the documents, claiming they were fabrications. Other voices joined in, creating a din made it impossible to understand individual words. But Carla wasn't finished. She stepped closer to the microphone, and something in her posture, the way she stood straighter, the way her voice cut through. The noise made the room gradually quiet again. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," she said. "I could have kept this discovery secret. I could have claimed that fortune for myself and my granddaughter, and no one would have been able to prove otherwise. We've been poor, we've been afraid, and we've needed help." Our voice grew stronger, but I was raised to believe that stealing is wrong, even when the people you're stealing from are dead, even when no one would ever know, even when keeping quiet would solve all your problems. She looked directly at Henderson, then at Henley, then at the other prominent families sitting in the front rows. The people who forged Charles Whitmore's signature and stole his daughter's inheritance didn't just commit crimes. They taught their children that it was acceptable to build wealth on the suffering of others. They created a legacy of injustice that has shaped this community for nearly a century. The room was silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something that would change Millbrook forever. But that legacy ends today. Asterisk. The silence that followed Carla's final statement stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone began to clap. The applause was taken up by others, growing stronger until nearly half the room was applauding, while the other half sat in stunned or angry silence. It was Mary Chun, who ran the small diner on Main Street, who stood up first. "Mrs. Martinez, I want to thank you for having the courage to do the right thing, even when it cost you personally. My family came to this town 30 years ago, and we've always felt like outsiders because we weren't part of the established families. Now we know why." Her comments seemed to open floodgates. Other voices rose from throughout the room. "My grandfather lost his farm in a deal with Charles Henley's father back in the 1940s," called out Robert Walsh, whose family had struggled for generations. Always seemed like he got cheated, but nobody would listen to complaints about the Hanley family. The Hendersons have been raising rents on Main Street for years, added Sandra Torres, who owned a small craft shop. Now we know where they got the money to buy up all that property in the first place. Emma tugged on Mrs. Patterson's sleeve and whispered something. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, and she slowly stood up. I have something to say, she announced, her voice shaky but carrying clearly through the room. The crowd quieted, sensing that something important was about to happen. I'm Grace Patterson, and my husband's grandfather was one of the men who participated in the theft that Mrs. Martinez has exposed tonight. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded paper. After Mrs. Martinez visited me last week and asked about the Whitmore family, I went up to my attic and found this. She unfolded the paper with care. It's a letter from my husband's grandfather to his son, my late father-in-law, written in 1952. In it, he confesses to forging Charles Whitmore's signature and describes how the group of them divided up the assets from the farmhouse. The room was completely silent now, everyone straining to hear what came next. He wrote that he'd been carrying the guilt for over 20 years and wanted his son to know the truth in case it ever came to light. He described the exact contents of a chest they'd found in the farmhouse and how they'd forged documents to make the theft legal. Mrs. Patterson walked slowly to the front of the room and handed the letter to Dr. Morrison. This letter describes items that match exactly what Mrs. Martinez found in that chest. My family has been living on stolen wealth for nearly a century, and I want to make it right. The emotional impact of Mrs. Patterson's confession seemed to break something in the room. Jonathan Henderson, who had been red-faced with anger throughout Carla's presentation, suddenly looked older and more tired. Mrs. Morrison, he said, standing slowly, my family will cooperate fully with any investigation. If we've benefited from theft, then we need to make restitution. Samuel Henley Jr. was shaking his head, still unwilling to accept what was happening. This is ridiculous. You can't hold people responsible for things their great-grandfathers might have done. And you certainly can't overturn a century of legitimate business dealings based on some papers found in an attic. But his protests were drowned out by other voices, other confessions, other expressions of support for doing the right thing regardless of the cost. Dr. Morrison approached the microphone, and the room gradually quieted to hear what she had to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that my family doesn't want to destroy this community. We don't want to bankrupt families whose only crime was being born into wealth that wasn't rightfully theirs. What we want is justice, and what we want is healing. She paused, looking out over the crowd with the same thoughtful expression Carla had seen in the old photographs of Eleanor Whitmore. Tomorrow, my attorney will file paperwork to establish the Eleanor Morrison Foundation, a charitable trust that will be funded by the recovery of stolen assets. The foundation's mission will be to provide educational opportunities, affordable housing, and small business loans to families in this community who have been economically disadvantaged. Emma had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now she stood up in her chair and raised her hand like she was in school. Asterisk. Yes, sweetheart? Dr. Morrison said, smiling at her. Will there be money to fix houses like ours, so other families don't have to worry about roofs that leak? Absolutely, Dr. Morrison said. That's exactly the kind of thing the foundation will do. Emma looked around the room with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved an important problem. Then everybody wins, right? The people who got their treasure stolen get it back, and the people who need help get help, and nobody has to be scared anymore. The simplicity of a 6-year-old's logic seemed to cut through the complexity that had paralyzed the adults in the room. She had just described exactly what justice looked like when it was guided by compassion rather than revenge. Mayor Davidson, who had been largely silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Martinez, the town of Millbrook owes you all a debt of gratitude for bringing this to light in a way that seeks healing rather than retribution. He looked around the room, his expression grave but hopeful. This community has been shaped by an injustice that happened before most of us were born. Tonight, we have the opportunity to begin healing that wound. As the meeting broke up, people didn't rush for the exits as they usually did after town meetings. Instead, they gathered in small groups, talking quietly, processing what they had learned, beginning the conversations that would reshape their community's understanding of itself. Carla packed up her documents and prepared to leave. But she was stopped by person after person who wanted to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her how much courage it had taken to do what she had done. Emma, tired from the long evening but still excited by all the attention, tugged on Carla's hand. "Grandma, are you happy about how the meeting went?" Carla looked around the room at Dr. Morrison, deep in conversation with families who wanted to know more about the foundation, at Mrs. Patterson being embraced by neighbors who respected her courage in coming forward, at Jonathan Henderson talking quietly with his lawyer about making things right. "Yes, Mia," she said, lifting Emma into her arms. "I think your great-grandfather would be very proud of what happened here tonight." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Carla felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since Miguel's death. They had done the right thing. And somehow, in doing the right thing, they had found their place in a community that was ready to heal old wounds and build something better from the truth. Asterisk. 6 months later, Carla stood on the front porch of the farmhouse and marveled at the transformation that stretched before her. The gardens that had been overgrown wilderness when she and Emma first arrived now bloomed with the same flowers that appeared in the old photographs she'd found in the chest. The house itself had been restored to its former glory, fresh white paint with dark green shutters, new roof, windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the porch. It was the sense of belonging that had taken root in Carla's heart, the knowledge that they were no longer strangers in a town that had forgotten how to trust, but part of a community that was learning to heal. Emma burst through the front door, her school backpack bouncing as she ran, followed more sedately by Lucy and Mrs. Patterson, who had become a regular afternoon visitor since the town meeting that had changed everything. "Grandma, guess what happened at school today?" Emma's excitement was infectious, as it always was. "What happened, Mia?" Mrs. Henderson announced that the new playground is going to be ready next week, and it's going to have the biggest slide in the whole county and a garden where we can learn to grow vegetables. And Lucy's dad is going to build special swings for kids who use wheelchairs. The playground was one of the first projects funded by the Eleanor Morrison Foundation. Dr. Morrison had kept her promise about healing rather than revenge. The foundation had negotiated settlements with the families who had benefited from the original theft. But the settlements were structured to create opportunities rather than punishment. The Henderson family had donated land for affordable housing. The Henleys had provided low-interest construction loans for families buying their first homes. Even the Patterson family had contributed by donating the property where the new playground was being built. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Are you excited about the slide?" "Yes, but I'm more excited about the garden. Mrs. Patterson is going to teach us how to grow the same flowers that Eleanor and James had in their garden." Mrs. Patterson smiled, settling into the rocking chair that now sat permanently on the porch. Eleanor Whitmore had quite a green thumb, according to the old photographs. I think she would be pleased to know that children are learning to tend the same varieties she loved. Carla looked out over the restored gardens, where a historical marker now stood near the gate. The bronze plaque told the story of Eleanor Whitmore and James Morrison, their love affair that had transcended family disapproval, and the fortune that had waited nearly a century to find its way to their descendants. But it also told the story of a community that had found the courage to face uncomfortable truths about its past and work together to build something better. Mrs. Martinez? Dr. Morrison's voice came from the front walk, where she stood with her arms full of what appeared to be framed documents. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to share something with you. Of course. Come up on the porch. Dr. Morrison climbed the steps and set down her burden carefully. These are the first diplomas from the Eleanor Morrison Educational Fund Scholarship Program. 5 young people from Millbrook will be starting college this fall with full scholarships funded by my great-grandmother's estate. She picked up one of the frames and handed it to Carla. This one is special. It's going to Maria Santos, whose family has been struggling since her father was injured at the construction site last year. She's going to study engineering and wants to come back to Millbrook to help design affordable housing. Carla studied the certificate, thinking about the ripple effects of justice served. James Morrison's careful investments, made with love for a wife and children he would barely get. To know, we're now creating opportunities for young people he could never have imagined. His loss had become their gain. His dreams had become their possibilities. There's something else, Dr. Morrison said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. The Foundation Board has voted to offer you a position as Community Outreach Coordinator. It would involve working with families who are applying for assistance, helping them navigate the programs, being a liaison between the Foundation and the community. Carla felt her breath catch. That's very generous, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Morrison said gently, you took on some of the most powerful families in this town armed with nothing but the truth and the courage to tell it. You uncovered a century-old conspiracy and chose justice over personal gain. If that doesn't qualify you to help other families find their way through difficult situations, I don't know what would. Emma looked up from the flowers she'd been picking. Does that mean you wouldn't work at the grocery store anymore, Grandma? It means I'd be working to help families like ours, sweetheart. Families who need someone to believe in them and help them find opportunities they might not know exist. Like how you helped find Eleanor and James's treasure. Something like that, yes. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. I think you should do it. You're really good at helping people, and you like it when families are happy. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed and Mrs. Patterson had returned to her own house, Carla sat in the restored living room and thought about the journey that had brought them here. The room bore little resemblance to the dusty, abandoned space they'd first entered 6 months earlier. The hardwood floors gleamed, the windows let in streams of golden light, and the fireplace was ready for the cozy fires they'd enjoy when winter came. But more than the physical restoration, it was the sense of purpose that had transformed their lives. She thought about Miguel, and how he had always said that the best treasures were the ones you found when you weren't looking for them. He would have been proud of the choice she'd made. Proud of the community that had emerged from the ashes of old secrets. Proud of the granddaughter who had learned that doing the right thing was its own reward. On the mantel, where Eleanor Whitmore had once displayed family photographs, Carla had placed a new picture, Emma's latest drawing, showing the farmhouse surrounded by friends and neighbors, with flowers blooming in the garden and children playing in the yard. At the bottom, in her careful 6-year-old handwriting, Emma had written, "Our house where dreams come true." Below that drawing sat the brass key that had started it all, displayed in a small frame alongside a photograph of Eleanor and James that Dr. Morrison had given her. They looked young and hopeful, full of dreams for the future they would never get to share. But their dreams hadn't died with them. They had waited, patient and hidden, until the right person came along to help them bloom again. As Carla turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, she paused at Emma's doorway to watch her granddaughter sleep peacefully in the room that had once belonged to another little girl nearly a century ago. Emma's breathing was steady and calm. the breathing of a child who felt safe and loved and secure in her place in the world. Tomorrow, Carla would call Dr. Morrison and accept the position with the foundation. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of helping other families find their way from desperation to hope. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of building a community where justice and compassion walked hand in hand. But tonight, she was simply a grandmother who had taken the biggest risk of her life and discovered that sometimes, when you bet everything on doing the right thing, you win more than you ever dared to dream possible. The farmhouse settled around them with the contented sighs of old wood that had found its purpose again, sheltering a family, holding their dreams, keeping them safe while they slept, and while they grew, and while they learned that the most valuable treasures were the ones you shared with others. Outside, the gardens rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the darkness, the spirits of Eleanor and James rested easy, knowing that their love story had found its happy ending at last.